This is Series 2, Episode 11, and I'm speaking with Lori Wike. Hello, Lori. It's very good to see you again. I've seen you fleetingly on Zoom calls over the last few months, which is a weird experience, because if we were at a live event together, I think we'd probably stop and chat for 5 minutes, but with Zoom, you're just in this alien environment where you can see people are there and think, oh, look who it is. And then you don't actually get to talk to them. So it's really nice to be able to sit down and talk to you now.
Yes, thanks so much for having me here today on the podcast, and it is great to finally get to chat as opposed to the alien Zoom bubbles.
Yeah, and of course, well, this is the second time you've been on the podcast.
That's true. That's true. Yes, with Mark Saltfight the first time. Yes.
Yeah, I promise not to keep you as long this time.
That's right. I think what did we do? We recorded for about 4 hours.
Yeah, I think it was over 4 hours in the end. But what do you expect with Mark? There's no shutting him up.
It was great fun.
It was, and in fact, I'll have to mention it was Series 1, Episode 23. One of my favorite episodes because I like palindromes, but it was so thorough and so much fun to record as well. Yes. And I really feel like it's something people should listen to because there's a lot of information there.
Very true.
Yeah. Not too much information. If I hadn't edited it, there might have been too much. I remember
I guess you could release an extended version.
I don't think the world needs to hear the 10-minute section where Mark talks about body surfing.
I don't know. I think there might be an audience for that.
So the main things I want to talk about today are, I think we have a lot of shared interests, but of course there's wordplay, particularly palindromes, which is how we met. And then there's music. So as I say, there's a huge episode about palindromes already. So I'm sure we might mention palindromes, but it won't be the focus of this. But here's the first question. I'm very curious to know how you got interested in word games and puzzles to start with.
Well, I've always loved them from being a very young child and just having access to several Martin Gardner books. And I just love the word puzzles, the mathematical puzzles, the ones that I can understand. And it was always a fascination from a very young age for me. The obsession with palindromes is fairly recent, about the last 10 years or so. But I've certainly had an interest in puzzles for really pretty much all of my life.
Yeah, it's about 10 years or so for me as well, palindromes.
Mm-hmm.
But I was never really into puzzles when I was younger. I played them. I think all children do. It was through poetry that I got interested in more extreme forms of word manipulation.
Interesting.
And of course, I played games like Scrabble, which
sure
you do as a kid. I mean, were you into things like that?
I was never a huge Scrabble player. My favorite game was Boggle, in terms of like a major kind of word game that I would play. I think Big Boggle came out at some point in my childhood, and it was my obsession as an only child to find people to play Boggle with me. Yeah, so. And when I couldn't, then I'd have to just kind of make up my own versions of games to play by myself, which seamlessly turned into my obsession with wordplay.
Well, I guess Boggle and Scrabble are both kind of anagram based, especially Scrabble. Boggle, I suppose, is a bit more related to palindromes because you are trying to read things in all directions. So it's interesting.
So, yes, yeah.
And so, have you got caught up in the whole Wordle thing?
I was fascinated with it as a phenomenon, and I played it pretty much every day for several months, and I slowly sort of got out of the habit of it. When I was doing it every day, it was consistent, and then after I missed a few days, I just kind of fell off the Wordle grid. And but I liked it very much, and it was so interesting to see how it just caught up with the popular imagination at a time. In the way that it did and just took off. I thought that was quite fascinating to witness.
Yeah, I said this on the last episode, but the first Wordle I played was the 1st of January this year.
Oh, wow.
So now I probably will quit at some point, but I've decided I've got to get through this year, just to do it every day this year, and not get any wrong, which I haven't yet. I've nearly, when you get those ones where you've got four of the letters, but one missing, and you just have to.
And there's so many choices, and that's the tricky one.
So one of the biggest things in the wordplay community is crosswords, cryptic crosswords. And in fact, the first time we met in person was it was the World Palindrome Championship, which I thought that's got to be the most important thing going on, surely. No, it was just this small sideshow at a much bigger tournament. I'm gonna have to put my glasses on. I always forget this. ACPT, American Crossword Puzzle Tournament, which I knew. Obviously, I was joking. I knew it was going to be bigger than the small thing we were doing. But I didn't realize just how big it is. I mean, it's huge. I mean, why aren't palindromes as popular as crosswords? Doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, it doesn't seem fair, and maybe that will change. Maybe that will change, and we'll overturn the dominance of crossword puzzles at some point. But it is a huge event. It's a huge event that people go to, year after year after year, and it's quite wonderful. I loved being able to observe what was happening, in addition to our component of it with the palindrome competition, which was great fun.
Yeah, people take it so seriously.
Very, very seriously, yes. I don't know that, at least with the 8 of us who were there, that I think we were all fairly laid back. I don't know that we quite had the intense crossword puzzle tournament mindset that we were able to observe, but it's quite interesting.
Have you ever attended that tournament as a participant, or is it not your sort of thing?
No, I enjoy solving crossword puzzles. It's not a daily pursuit or anything. For me, it's much more interesting to create puzzles than to solve them, even though I enjoy solving them as well. And I always thought, the analog for a palindrome competition would almost be a crossword puzzle construction competition. That would be almost a closer analog than to the solving of the crossword puzzle, which becomes almost this athletic event. I mean, it's just remarkable to watch. And I was familiar, of course, with the documentary Wordplay, which had come out several years before we were there at ACPT. And I just thought it was fascinating to be there and see the enthusiasm and intensity in the crossword world.
Yeah, I like your idea of inventing the constraints being the competition. That sounds fun. Have you made many cryptic crossword puzzles or any?
No, it's interesting because there's the kind of the American crossword puzzle style, which I think has a certain amount of wordplay involved and a certain amount of trivia involved and quick recollection in order to solve. And then with the cryptic crosswords, they're quite a different animal. I have David Assel's book. I know he was recently on the podcast, and Rewarding the Brain. It's quite an interesting book. And I'm not a huge cryptic crossword solver. I find them very interesting to read about, and I thought that I would enjoy designing cryptic crosswords, but I have never actually done so. I've designed all sorts of variations of crossword puzzles, one where you simply make a crossword puzzle where all the answers are palindromes. I call them crossdromes, things like that. But I've designed some kind of traditional American style crossword puzzles as well. I worked with this woman, Nancy Solomon, who was kind of a luminary, I guess you would say, in the crossword construction community, where she would mentor people learning to construct crossword puzzles. And it was interesting to me, but ultimately, my obsession with palindromes kind of overtook that for me.
That's interesting, because I'm the same. I would say that I have tried to get into solving cryptic crosswords, but I know I'd have much more fun if I was setting them instead.
Yes.
And I said this to David Astle in the podcast, and obviously he agrees. But he also said, he just loves all of it. He loves solving them. He loves making them. but he spoke about how the community is divided on an issue, which is whether you always stick to the same few formats, the established question formats,
Right.
or whether you try to invent your own question formats. And he's in the latter camp there. He wants to be more expansive and experimental. And I imagine that you would be that way too. I mean, I know I would.
Oh, definitely. And some years back, I was able to acquire on Abe Books an old Torquemada book of crossword puzzles. This is about the time that Cain's Jawbone was going to be re-released. That was Torquemada's puzzle novel. Anyway, this was a very different publication, just of some of his best crossword puzzles that were compiled in a collection. And I loved the fact that, I for the first time I was seeing these grids that didn't look like the traditional crossword grid with the kind of rotational symmetry, or even the typical cryptic crossword grid, which has many more black squares. And of course, those can be in different shapes, but they were just simply squares, and you would have little lines dividing things. And sometimes there would be these kind of cryptic clues, and sometimes it would be in the form of verse. For the clues, sometimes it would be almost like a Mad Libs kind of thing, where there would be a story, and you'd have to fill in the missing words within the crossword grid. And I'm quite fascinated by this famous British crossword setter. Torquemada was his pen name. Edward Pavis Mathers, I believe, was his actual name. And yeah, just really, really quite interesting. And but yeah, absolutely. I'm always interested in how to do something a little bit differently, and trying to, well, what if I did this, or what if I did that? And most of the time they tend to be just terrible ideas, or the constraints are just ridiculous, and the product ends up being like, okay, whatever. But the process was fun, the experimentation. And sometimes it's like, oh, this is actually really good. This turned out well. So yeah, I would definitely be in the latter camp of that divide in the cryptic community.
Yes, you reminded me about Cain's Jawbone. I have a copy. I think we were both involved with the Kickstarter campaign, which means we're both mentioned in the book.
Yes.
And, I mean, I'm clueless with it. I can't solve it at all. No, I can't get close to it. But of course, like I say, it was a Kickstarter, and we were involved. It was a small thing to start with, and then it went viral on TikTok.
Exactly.
And now it's selling hundreds of thousands. So that's quite amazing.
And it's wonderful. It's wonderful, yeah, to see something like a puzzle game like Wordle, take off in the digital realm, and Cain's Jawbone through the magic of TikTok, becoming this viral phenomenon. And I mean, that is a terribly, terribly difficult puzzle. I think I made a little headway. I certainly didn't finish solving it or anything. It requires an awful lot of work. But it's I found it just fascinating as a concept. And I believe Torquemada dedicated it to Dorothy Sayers, who's one of my very favorite, detective fiction writers. And anyway, everything about it is fascinating to me. I'm a voracious reader of kind of early 20th century detective fiction, and so it's I love it. I would love to solve the puzzle. I've not yet. I've had to put it aside for a while, but it does fascinate me.
You weren't tempted when you had COVID to just dedicate that time?
I know. I did. It did occur to me, I should really get this little puzzle book box back out with the 100 loose leaf pages, and start devoting some more time to it. But it didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, so getting back to the idea of, as David said in a previous episode, either sticking to the traditional ways of going about creating crosswords, or trying to push the boundaries a bit. I find this area very interesting. I'm generally interested in the tension that exists between the experimental avant-garde side and the more conservative, aesthetically conservative, I have to say,
right?
Not politically.
Sure.
Because I find myself going between those two stages. I really like traditional forms, but at the same time, I want to do something that hasn't been done before.
Right.
Would you say that when you're writing an elaborate palindromic form, or when you're creating a new puzzle, would you say that you are still interested in expanding what's been done before into new territory, rather than throwing out everything that's been done before and starting afresh?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's, you're always, you're working with what has come before, in any kind of way. And then sometimes seeing it in a new light, or juxtaposition that hasn't quite been done before in some sense, sometimes a small expansion, sometimes a very large leap of an expansion. So for example, for you, and when I met you and you showed me your leaflet, The White Whale, and I realized, oh my goodness, paired letter palindromes. How did I not think of this? And then, moving from the paired letter palindromes to your creation of the alendrome, and my just incredible admiration for that, and thinking, oh, why didn't I think of that? But it's just remarkable. And so, yes, there's, the use of different units for palindromes, for example, the letter unit, the conventional palindrome, then the word unit, or the word is the unit that becomes reversed, or line unit palindrome. But then to the remarkable thing of thinking 2 letters as the unit, or 3 letters, and then I think brilliant leap you made of the numbers can change, and when you created the alendromes, and I just marveled at that when I met you there in Stanford at the palindrome championship, and just thought, wow. And also, why didn't I think of that? So.
Oh, well, thank you very much. That's very kind. But of course, you have invented lots of things. I don't know how much we want to. I can say that we Penteract Press are publishing a book of yours next year, which is puzzle based. I don't know how much you want to say about it. I don't know how much is meant to be a surprise for people. I'll leave it entirely up to you.
I'm happy to talk. To give a brief tease about the puzzle book. It at least currently is titled Jump Search, and it is exactly, it's a kind of formal exploration of a couple of previous puzzle forms that synthesizes them in a way that I don't think has ever been done. So we're all familiar with the word search, which in my kind of research about word search puzzles, I discovered it's a relatively recent invention in its present form, kind of developed in the 1960s. And there's some controversy over exactly who developed it first. But one could also, like many things, look back and then trace, backwards in time, as we palindromists like to do, find historical predecessors, and in word squares, which I know we share a fascination with word squares, of course. And then there's this very interesting work, this 4th century Latin poet Optation, who wrote these twisted verses, which were grids of letters in which words and verses were hidden. So a kind of prototype of a word search puzzle from ancient times. And anyway, so I like word search puzzles. I liked making shaped word search puzzles. That was a project I started doing at the kind of beginning of the pandemic. And I had played around with that and then put them aside for a while. And this all came out of Cain's Jawbone. And in fact, my grappling with Cain's Jawbone, my frustrations with Cain's Jawbone at not being able to solve the puzzle, but loving it nevertheless. And as a kind of response to Torquemada in my own mind, wanting to design a kind of puzzle that was a response to Cain's Jawbone. And I explored this in this fantastic poetry workshop by Steve Fowler, who, of course, another podcast guest with Penteract, and it's been published by Penteract, and just wonderful guy and quite brilliant, and just this incredible future-facing poetry's workshop he put together, where I started working on a project, and it too is a puzzle, very, very complex puzzle, which remains unfinished. It's in my head, but there's a lot of physical work to be done for that. And in my research for designing that puzzle, I came across this genre of logic mazes. And we all know what a maze is. We have ideas of books of mazes and tracing, things like that. And then there can be distinctions between a maze and a labyrinth. Some people will use the words interchangeably. Sometimes a labyrinth is simply a maze that has only one path. And the act is simply following the path, whereas a maze will have different paths with dead ends, blind alleys, and such. And I discovered something called a number maze as I was, tangentially, I move very tangentially with things. And as I discovered these number mazes, I thought, wow, this is really fascinating. And a number maze is kind of like a grid of numbers. And each number in the grid will tell you how many spaces within the grid you can move. I discovered this in the work of Robert Abbott, and he wrote a couple of books in the 90s called Mad Mazes and Super Mazes. And these are very, very difficult mazes. They're logic puzzles. They are mazes that are sometimes referred to as multi-state puzzles, because where one is within the maze at one point in time, at a latter point in time, you can be at the same point but have different. You're coming at it in a different direction. So it's quite fascinating. But anyway, the point of it is it's a form of logic puzzle, but it's also a maze. And I just love these number mazes. And I was visiting my family. I was in North Carolina visiting my family for a week, and joking, my dad infamously has always hated puzzles of any sort. And his older sister, my Aunt Jane, feels similarly. And we were joking about this. And I happened to be thinking about these number mazes. And so I kind of jokingly said, oh, I'm going to make a puzzle for my Aunt Jane because she loves them so much. I thought I would amuse her by it. And so I said, oh, all these numbers, I'm really a word person, I'm a letter person. So what if I add letters into this puzzle? And I'm just kind of, at the kitchen counter doodling and designing this thing. And I said, wait a second, this is actually quite interesting. And so I made this very simple version of what I have been calling jump search puzzles. And my Aunt Jane sort of sighed and said, hey, thanks, Lori. And then the more I thought about it, and I realized, wait, this has a lot of potential. And anyway, a jump search puzzle, it combines this number maze form, which Robert Abbott thought he had invented the number maze. It turns out Sam Lloyd, the famous kind of American puzzle pioneer in late 19th century, is the person who kind of created the very first number maze back in, I think, 1898, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, it's very interesting. And then when you combine the numbers with letters, you get, again, this grid of letters, and you have to make logical deductions in order to figure out, how do I connect these letters? How do I find the hidden words within this grid? And I have another kind of longstanding interest in the history of cryptography, kind of classical cryptography, cryptanalysis. And some of my favorite historical ciphers are things that would fall under the category of steganography. So anything that's hidden in plain sight. So I love null ciphers, for example. And a null cipher, the very simplest version of a null cipher is an acrostic. So you have letters, and then you have very important letters. And in one pattern, it's the first letter of each word, or the first letter of each line. That would be a very simple kind of null cipher. The other letters are essentially nulls. And a jump search, in a way, is a form of a null cipher. There are letters in this grid that are important, and there are letters in the grid that are not important. And the goal in solving these puzzles is determining, through a series of logical deductions, what are the important letters and how are they connected? What is the pattern in which they are connected? Anyway, and so it just started out as a visit to my family, a way to entertain myself and a family member. And then I realized, wow, this is really interesting. And I started pursuing it and making kind of different versions of the jump search puzzles. It's a kind of formal expansion of again, two different types of puzzles: the word search and the number maze. And I think they're quite a bit of fun. I find them very fun, at least. So I'm thrilled that Penteract is going to publish this. And anyway, that's kind of the teaser.
Yeah, well, we're thrilled too, and it's got so much going for it. It's so amazing how it is a synthesis of all these things. I mean, it's visual poetry as well.
Yeah, I love that. There's of course, as you know, there's a final meta puzzle at the end. So the puzzles are all thematically connected. There's a kind of final meta puzzle, and in that one in particular, in solving it, I looked at it, I said, this is kind of a create your own Vispo kind of a situation here, and it's really quite pleased with how it all turned out, and I hope that people will enjoy it as much as I enjoyed creating it.
It's interesting to find out that it really started with those word searches you were doing at the start of the pandemic. So I enjoyed those. They were great. But again, there was something extra, wasn't there? They weren't just word searches. You're always looking to add the something extra.
Yeah. So, I was, I think one of the first ones, the shaped word searches I made. So it was, again, a kind of calligram shaped like a martini glass, and it was different types of alcohols, to be found within this martini glass shaped word search. And I always like to have the leftover letters, they also would spell out something kind of fun. So trying to design that, I made a shaped word search shaped like the Great Salt Lake one time. I did a number of those and had a lot of fun making those. But yeah, that was actually the real genesis of it for me, was when I started making the shaped word searches at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, the fun definitely comes across, and they are fun to solve. And another good thing about jump search is it's difficult, but it's not one of these things where it's not Cain's Jawbone. It's not something that's you're gonna have to spend years trying to figure out. It's
yeah, it's I think it's quite fun. I've had a number of kind of test solvers with my friends in the orchestra, particularly our harp player, who lives down the street from me, and I keep promising her to bring her fancy cheeses for this, and I still haven't done that. But yeah, I think that people who have engaged with kind of the early versions of these puzzles have really enjoyed them, and yeah, it kind of developed as a tangential thing from a very, very complex puzzle that is, again, my response to Torquemada. But jump search itself, these are fun. These are not going to take years of your life to solve. They're quite enjoyable, I think, to solve.
Yeah, definitely. So there we are. We've plugged the upcoming book, and you mentioned then your orchestra.
Yes.
This is the other thing I really like to talk to you about. I imagine that you get a lot of downtime to play with palindromes and crosswords. Is that just part of the lifestyle in an orchestra?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of, you have to hurry up and wait kind of situations, where you're on a long bus tour, things like that. I started writing a lot of palindromes on these bus rides I would do, because I get motion sickness if I try to read something, but I can, think about things in my head. And so I started writing palindromes in my head on these long bus rides and trips. And sometimes you have downtime where you're not on a specific number, but you still have to be in place, that kind of situation. So things to entertain myself during periods like that. And the schedule can vary wildly. Of course, during the pandemic, I had quite a bit of downtime as we were furloughed for an extensive period of time. And so I tried to, think of things that were both fun and productive and engaging to do during that time. And then the first year of the pandemic, things were quite strange, especially being a woodwind player. I play the bassoon. And so the woodwind and brass players in the orchestras, we were the great dangers, of course, because we can't be masked while playing, and there's also just as singing, of course, can provide these super spreader events, playing wind instruments, or some instruments much more than others, can have a similar kind of effect as singing. So very complex trying to navigate all of that, particularly during that first year when we went back to work.
Yeah, nobody wants somebody in the room blowing through a pipe during a pandemic.
No, they don't. And we didn't really want to be together doing that either with each other. So yeah, quite tricky.
So this is your profession, this is your career when you're not playing with puzzles.
Right.
So I'm really interested to know how you got into this, especially the bassoon, which I think that must be an unusual instrument to start out with. I mean, I don't know if do you play other instruments?
I did, in junior high school and high school, I played the trombone for a while. I played a few other instruments. The only other one that I developed any kind of proficiency on was the trombone, which I would play in jazz bands and things like that. But yeah, I did. I played a little bit of piano kind of in elementary school. And then in junior high school, I met with the band directors, these just wonderful people. And they had us do kind of a musical aptitude test, and I just did well, and blah, blah, blah. We were discussing various instruments, and the high school band director at the time, Mark Johnson, he just passed away a couple of days ago. So he's been on my mind lately, but he said, how about the bassoon? And I said, sure. What's a bassoon? I had no idea. So, I didn't come from a musical, well, I did come from a musical family, but not like in a kind of orchestral musical family as many of my colleagues do. So yeah, that's how I got my start. And there was I was thinking about parallels between that we share. And I think there's this TV interview when I was in the 3rd grade, in which I was asked what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I said, I want to be a writer, an astronaut, and a punk rock star. So anyway, I did, I do some writing, and I do some music. The astronaut thing, that would have been about 1985. I kind of changed my mind in 1986 about the astronaut thing. But those were the things I wanted to do from a very young age. And of course, you, in your musical background, you were a punk rocker. So I think this was really interesting how with your start there, and I believe in it.
I wouldn't have been a punk rocker if I'd chosen bassoon. I don't think there's not much call for it.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say so. I'm all for pushing boundaries, but yeah, the bassoons, pretty much one is either going to teach or play in an orchestra when it comes to playing the bassoon. But yeah, that's how I got my start in music, and so I play the bassoon just every day, and some weeks are just insanely intense, and others are a little bit lighter.
But once you this is a stupid question, I don't know, I'm sorry for asking it. Once you were first shown the bassoon, someone said play this, didn't you look at it and think, couldn't I have a flute or something that's easier to carry around and won't get broken easily?
I was really intrigued by it. I loved the sound of it from the very beginning. I had no idea that I would have to spend my life crafting and making my own reeds for the instrument. Now, if someone had told me that, I may have made a very different decision, because as much of my life is involved in just simply practicing to perform at a high level. An equal amount is spent in literally carving Cain to make my mouthpiece and continually remake my mouthpiece, because you have to keep making them all the time. I had no idea I'd have to make reeds for the rest of my life, and I enjoy that on some level, and in another level it's can be exhausting. So yeah, but it's a funny instrument. The other thing that's unusual about the bassoon is that I think in terms of the fingering patterns, it probably beats everything else, in terms of complexity. They're just ridiculous fingering patterns. I always tell my students, every time you sit down to play the bassoon, it's a form of troubleshooting, and you're solving a Rubik's Cube with whatever piece of music is being put in front of you. That's what playing the bassoon is. You're constantly solving a Rubik's Cube, but you're constantly solving it differently. You're doing these things where you're making patterns and designs on a cube, essentially. That's kind of the analog, and developing great technical facility. That's kind of the analog would be speed cubing, for example. So.
Wow. Is it, just going back to the reeds, because I think I knew this, but I didn't quite appreciate it. Is it hard to make them?
Yes, it takes quite a bit of time. You have to do it in different stages, let the cane kind of cure and stabilize in between different steps of making the reeds. And so, some pieces of cane are better than others. Some pieces of cane you almost can't make a bad reed, and other pieces of cane you really have to coax them into becoming a good reed. And so much is so to be so dependent on the basically what is a vegetable can be a little bit maddening at times. They change with the weather, the temperature, the humidity, the altitude. So it's this constant process. Yeah.
Oh, I feel really bad now, because I've been moaning all week to Clara because my guitar is broken and I need to put some contact cleaner in it. And like, there's every 3 or 4 years, perhaps, you might have to do a tiny bit of maintenance on a guitar, and I moan about it. And you're having to make these reeds all the time.
Well, every instrument has its things. Yeah, for bassoon, it's the reeds, and yeah, just having to constantly recraft the mouthpiece, and how much it determines everything that's the great difficulty there.
I also want to go back to what you said about wanting to be a punk rocker. I'm going to throw out the rest of the questions now. I just want to talk about this. What
I was in
inspired
third grade. I think at that time, I don't know. I think I was dressing up as Cyndi Lauper for Halloween in third grade, something like that. And I had very little knowledge of actual punk rock music, but I wanted to be a punk rocker when I was in third grade. And yeah, I came across that. I think my parents had somehow had it transferred over to a DVD format at some point, and I came across it a few years ago and just laughed because I had kind of forgotten about it.
So you went to classical. You went to the opposite. Were there any major inspirations? Any particular composers?
Well, I mean, as a bassoonist, one pretty much has to love Stravinsky and Shostakovich, because they wrote so incredibly well for the bassoon, and featured the bassoon, and really just exploited it in a way that just, I mean, that's every bassoonist is going to love Shostakovich, playing Shostakovich and Stravinsky, although it can be terrifying as well. But yeah, in terms of just favorite composers, in terms of the orchestral repertoire, those would probably be two of my favorites. But yeah, I went the classical route, which is generally probably a good idea as a bassoon player. and I did my undergraduate in music, and then took a big detour. So yeah, I then went with something else we share. I started but did not finish my PhD in comparative literature. So yeah, kind of interesting there. And it was a pretty big detour, but again, love of words, love of literature, love of critical theory, continental philosophy, which in the US, continental philosophy is largely housed in comparative literature departments. And so I did that, and I never actually finished the PhD, but it was a very interesting time for me. And I've always kind of had interest in too many things, and had difficulty kind of deciding on things, what I really wanted to focus on. But I did go back to music as a profession after that detour.
I don't know if you've heard the episode I've recently done with Marion Christie.
I haven't heard that one yet.
But yeah, she said the same thing as you, and I agreed that it's difficult when you're interested in lots of different things to to settle on something. I certainly in my own life I found that I still haven't settled on anything. I'm in my 40s. I still haven't found out what I want to do properly, apart from poetry.
Yeah, I always like to say that too. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up, you know. Sometimes people ask me that question. I just answer wildly different things. But it's always been, I think, helpful for me as well to have different things to focus on, because I do get so incredibly obsessive with things. And if I can step back from one thing I'm obsessed with to focus on a different obsession, it tends to give me a certain type of balance.
And so your musical interest, then, you mentioned there are certain things you will be asked to play more than others. But what about what you listen to? Are you interested in the very contemporary art music, or are you more interested in earlier works?
Yeah, I would say very eclectic interest, and kind of voracious interest in terms of what I listen to and like to play. I love to work with composers and performing more recently composed music. And in my role in the orchestra, it's a mix of things. It's an awful lot of concerts, but and I simply have to play what I'm told to play, essentially. And the creativity is, it's not unlike wordplay. It's creativity within constraints. And you might be playing the same piece, 3 or 4 programs of the same piece within a week, and you might want to be able to play certain aspects of it a little differently each time, in a way that is, still not completely out there. But I enjoy playing chamber music or doing kind of the solo repertoire. So I'm interested in doing everything. So yeah, so here in Salt Lake City, anything that has Rachmaninoff on it will pretty much sell out the hall. So there's a lot of Rachmaninoff that's programmed. It's great. I like playing Rachmaninoff too. But trying to get a balance of newer music and more experimental music, along with kind of a historical breadth, where you're also playing Baroque era music, for example, and different operas, symphonic works, chamber music, the kind of the whole thing. Pops, film music is a big thing now, where we will perform the soundtracks to films, and those are really quite fun to do. And I think it's interesting because it brings in an audience which thinks perhaps has no particular interest in so-called classical music, but they love film music, and that's kind of what it is. It's can be symphonic music in some instances, and of course different configurations of music. But yeah, it's in terms of what I do every day, it varies a lot, but I listen to literally everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to ask you, one of the questions on the list here is about improvisation, and do you have any opportunity for that? So I suppose it would be the more contemporary music where you get that chance.
I'm terrible at improvising, but I can appreciate it, hearing it.
You've told me that you don't compose music.
No, I was thinking about that as I was thinking about this podcast today. And yeah, my musical interests have really just been confined primarily to performing. Which is, creative in a different way than composition. And I've just never really explored that. I don't know, perhaps I will at some point, but I haven't in the past, which is kind of interesting because in every other realm, I'm so interested in constructing things and the composition of palindromes, the composition of puzzles, the composition of poetic forms. But in music, it's such a focus on performing, and so that it's kind of an interesting thing as I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because you're clearly a very creative person, and you clearly got a lot of technical skill musically. So it does seem strange you haven't put them together, but I suppose it might be.
It's odd.
Yeah. But it might be the nature of how you learn to do it, because with puzzles and palindromes, you've followed your own path.
Right.
Whereas it seems like you had quite a formal training musically.
Exactly.
Whereas,
yeah.
When I learned to play guitar, I taught myself how to play guitar.
Oh, wow.
So I was writing songs from the start. I'd learn 2 chords, and then I'd write a song with those 2 chords.
Wow.
Then I'd learn a 3rd chord and write a song with the 3 chords until it was built up. So it was the composition and learning just went entirely together.
We're intertwined from the beginning, yes.
Right. Yeah, but of course I didn't have a formal education in music the way you did. So I suppose from the start you were taught, I don't know, do as you're told, for lack of a better phrase.
Well, you know, I mean, to a degree, you know, I mean, there's almost kind of a sport component, I think, in performance, especially in kind of the just the amount of training just to be able to kind of master and be able to win a position. But yeah, it's something about that. But it's a different kind of creativity. I was trying to think about that, and most of I don't have very clear thoughts on it, but it is interesting. I have been thinking about that, and it would seem that I would be interested in composing music, but I've never done so.
So on the performance side of things, and again, I think I've just put a few stupid questions here. This is a question I'm sure you've been asked a lot, and that everyone who's in an orchestra has been asked a lot. To what extent are you paying attention to the conductor?
Oh, this is a great question. It depends so much on you know, what conductor is on the podium. I would say I really enjoy doing performances without conductors. That can be a lot of fun, where you know, the concertmaster, for example, show a few things, or, you know, a chamber music setting, no conductor. Some conductors can simply be useful. Some conductors can be really, really wonderful and quite brilliant in terms of kind of shaping a vision of some things. When you have so many people on stage, if you're playing with 85 or 90 people, it's difficult for that to be a total collaboration. It helps to have a kind of central figure in which to kind of keep things unified. But, you know, in many instances, if you have a conductor who's not so great, for example, they're essentially being completely ignored. The musicians are playing and you know, doing acrobatics to play well in spite of whatever nonsense might be occurring on the podium. So unfortunately, that occurs quite a bit, because it can be quite difficult to tell, without being a musician working with a conductor, to really tell that the quality, because, you know, they're not making any sounds. So it's very obvious when I make a mistake. It's not so obvious when a conductor is making a mistake. It's very obvious to the people on stage, but yeah, it's quite a strange hierarchical structure in orchestras, and but you know, especially with chamber orchestras, it's perfectly possible and can be quite exciting to perform without a conductor. But there are great conductors, and I have worked with many great conductors and have enjoyed it greatly. So it's a mix. It just depends on the individual situation. If one is, sometimes one has to really actively ignore the stuff coming from up front. And that can be maddening. Yeah, that can be absolutely maddening, because it makes your job, you know, 10 times as hard as it should be, where you're just trying to block out what's happening, because it's just a terrible distraction, and no one is paying attention. Everyone is actively ignoring. But again, there are really great conductors, and there are a lot of not so great conductors, and it just depends on the individual circumstance.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you've got a really bad conductor and you can't get them out of your line of sight.
Yeah, it becomes this exercise in intense focus to completely ignore something, you know, and just try to block it out.
And what about the way you interact with the rest of the orchestra? Because I've only been in bands of 4, maybe at most 5 people, and I'm trying to think back to it. Was I paying attention to what everybody else was doing individually, or was it more like I'm one entity and everyone else together is another entity? If you see what I mean.
Right.
Do you
Yeah.
have that, or
So
does each grouping of instruments act as its own entity that you're trying to meld with?
yeah, I think to a certain degree, yes. So you're constantly, it's this very dynamic process where you're doing your own thing, but it's always in response and in collaboration, where you have to turn on a dime with what someone else is doing. Whether you're, oh, that phrase was done this way by the flute who just plays it right before me, and so I'm going to do the exact same thing when it comes to me, and you get a kind of sixth sense of what your colleagues are doing, where you can anticipate what they're doing, and it's a workplace where you're not really talking either. I mean, there's some talking involved, but you're picking up on nonverbal cues and your knowledge of such and such a player and things like that, with some discussion, during breaks and stuff. But yeah, you have to constantly make these micro adjustments based on what's coming off the podium, what's happening over here. Oh, I've got this line with the basses, so you're changing your focus based on the other instruments you're playing with, and the importance of the line, and I've got a medium important line here. No, I'm the important line here, and this kind of thing, and constantly making these on the spot decisions, and having some spontaneity involved in it as well. And it's difficult to be spontaneous with 85 people on stage, but you want to have a little bit of it within that I think makes things more interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. So, and certain things can be just so terribly stressful to play for, I mean, some things can be medium stressful, and those are enjoyable. And then some things are so stressful that you might be tuning out. You're so tuned into what you yourself are doing that you're not perhaps paying quite as much attention to what's happening during that moment, for example.
It is fascinating because there's the hive mind, but it is undeniably
the Borg.
But it is inescapably also a collection of individuals, and you're going to occasionally hear one individual stand out and have to respond to that. But at the same time, it's impossible that you'll be mindful of what every single member is doing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a splitting of focus and constantly shifting, and again, constantly making these micro adjustments as one is in the moment.
I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the various things you do and the various things I do as well, specifically music and, first of all, palindromes, but also wordplay in general. Do you find that there's a strong connection? Because I think I certainly do.
I do think there's a strong connection. I mean, when you're writing palindromes, you're focusing on things other than just simply the semantic. For example, you're focused on patterns that are extra semantic. And in music, again, it's a type of language that is, not semantic. I mean, of course, there's program music, and there can be connections, and any kind of music with lyrics, and word painting, things like that. But there are these extra semantic and non-semantic qualities, but highly complex patterns. And so I think this exploration and this play with patterns. I mean, what's interesting is the language that we use, the metaphor we use, play, that works for both music and for wordplay. It's this idea of play, which I think is quite interesting. But I do see definite connections there. And of course, there are musical palindromes. For example, I just got your Redder recently, and Cleiades of the Mist. And I think you're working on another project with backmasking, I believe.
I'm starting it. It's proving harder to figure out than I thought it would. Because when you do backmasking, you always get that whooshing sound. I'm trying to find ways that I can play where I won't get that, but it's pretty hard to eliminate. So we'll see how that progresses. But and of course,
I'm fascinated.
And of course, my guitar needs fixing, so that's holding it. Yeah, the first thing I wrote down when I was writing this question out was patterns. So I'm glad you said that. I think that word gamers, word players, and musicians they have that in common. We are pattern seekers,
right?
For sure. Another thing that I think connects them is it's the use of for example, you get jazz standards, or you get typical chord sequences, the famous, you know, the one that goes at the root chord to the fifth, to the sixth, to the fourth, which is seemingly in every pop song of the last 40 years. And I think with something like palindromes or any wordplay, you're essentially using these standards, these formulae, if you like, the, you know, Eva, can I, something, something, something in a cave. Yeah, exactly. So it's about, again, as we discussed earlier, it's taking the, what you might call the traditional. I don't know if Eva, can I in a cave should be called traditional, but you get the idea. It's a standard that you can work with, and you can take it to all sorts of new places. And music does that too.
Yeah, the variations it's kind of mind-boggling. One might initially think that, you know, for example, with palindromes, there must be kind of a limited number, but, you know, as you become more involved with writing palindromes, you just realize it's kind of limitless in some ways. And I think it's very true. Again, you have the kind of these standards in music, these the formulae, but within these certain sets, there are so many possibilities for variations, and even within, you know, it's always interested me as a performer, even performing the so-called the same piece, and, you know, what is the musical work? That's a question that fascinates me too. You know, there's the visual nomenclature of a score. There is, you know, the kind of mental oration of it one might have. And then there's a million performances of it and recordings of performances, but even just performing the same work, you know, being able to perform the same work, each iteration is different. And that kind of difference in repetition is quite fascinating to me as well. And the kind of interest and creativity within that, even within these formulae that we have, the capacity for difference and variation is potentially limitless.
It is, and if you just think about melody, I mean, okay, I'm restricting it to a single octave, but we're essentially talking about 12 notes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not a huge number at all, and yet an infinite number of melodies from that. So yeah, when people ask me if, you know, when will all the palindromes be solved, I say never.
Never. Exactly. Never even.
So, okay, well, it's been wonderful talking to you. Before we finish, I'd like to hear more about what you're doing. Obviously, we know we've discussed Jump Search. Is there anything else you're working on? And feel free to talk about music or poetry or puzzles or palindromes, anything.
Gosh, yes. Well, you know, I constantly kind of try to think of ideas and things to explore. I had taken a few months off where I don't think I had written any palindromes. And then when I had COVID a few weeks back, I had kind of a little bit of downtime, and I just started writing lots of palindromes and trying new things, trying to write some visual palindromes that were actual words, but in different shapes and things like that. I tried to do I've written a couple of palindromic sonnets, nothing like the brilliant ones that you write, but I tried to write one with an acrostic at the beginning, and realized with the rhyme scheme and the palindrome constraint how terribly difficult and what a terrible idea that was. But I forced myself to do it, and it was just such a wonderful feeling, you know, this when one is engaged in this difficult juggling kind of act, you know.
Do you find it's like a flow state?
Yes, I talk about that yes, it's like I'm in this zone, and I think this flow state, and it's like you're like one with the universe, you know, you're just or alone in the universe, and it's this very intense thing, and it's like, wow, where did the last 5 hours go? And it's incredibly satisfying and fascinating, and I don't know, brings me great happiness when I am involved in something, regardless of the quality of the ultimate product. You know, that's almost ancillary to me, but
it's worth it anyway. It is worth doing it anyway, just for your
it's worth it.
Pleasure.
Yeah,
I mean, you mentioned the white whale earlier. I wrote that in a day where I started work at about 8 a.m. and finished at midnight.
Wow.
And it was just, where did that
Wow.
day go? I was so lost in it. And it was so, I mean, it's the flow state thing is strange though, because is it pleasure or not? Because it's almost like you're so invested in it, you enjoy it, but it's not pleasure. It's a different thing.
No, it's not pleasure. It's yeah, it's really I feel like you described it as being just alone in the universe somehow. And in an earlier podcast, but I can't quite recall exactly what you said. But it is just, yeah, and it's intense work, but it's also, yeah, not pleasure isn't the right term for it. But it's great. And anytime I'm terribly stressed out about my job, or some upcoming performance, if I can just take a day where, yeah, I lose 5 or 6 hours or more, and it's very satisfying, very rejuvenating for me, even though I might be completely exhausted afterwards from just the juggling, and I may be dissatisfied with the ultimate product that comes out of it. But the exploration, the experimentation, that is very satisfying somehow.
Yeah, add one thing to this, so some of the conversations take a depressing turn, but about 10 years, or more than 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, I was seriously depressed. And it was around the time I started writing palindromes and anagrams. And I genuinely think it's what got me out of that depression. So the flow state may not be pleasure in itself, but it can actually be a nice distraction from whatever problems you're having. It can bring you out of a dark place.
It absolutely resonates with me. I mean, it's, yeah, if I'm having any kind of unhappiness, I know that if I can get back into my puzzle wordplay mindset for a certain period of time, that more than anything else will bring me some, if not pleasure or satisfaction, it will bring me some sort of relief. So that what you just said absolutely resonates with my own experience of these flow states and this kind of constraint-based composition of whatever is my latest obsession.
So you're going to continue to write for your own pleasure, and hopefully that will translate to other people's pleasure, and I'm sure it will. What about on the music side? What's coming up?
In the music side, I mean, there's the a million concerts on the calendar with the orchestra, just trying to keep up with those week to week. And then I try to do some solo performances and some chamber works, things like that, to kind of mix things up kind of on the side. And even though it can be, just trying to find the time to make those happen can be a little challenging, I think it's a very good thing to do, and just to kind of step out of the daily grind, so to speak. So I'm doing a trio by the Korean composer Lee Sang-yoon that's coming up on Halloween, and then playing a piece by a French composer, Philippe Herson, called Hopi. It's kind of based on Hopi folk songs. That's an unaccompanied bassoon piece, and that's, I think, a week after that, some point in early November. And then sometimes I look at my calendar, I'm like, oh, why did I agree to do these? But they, I think they're very important for having some sort of musical balance. And then I have a concerto, a duo concerto performance coming up with the orchestra in April with the principal clarinet player. We're doing the Richard Strauss duet concertino for clarinet and bassoon. And so that of course takes, a lot of extra preparation, in addition to just the usual week-to-week preparation for the orchestra. So those are kind of the most immediate projects that I have going on for this year, for music-wise.
Yeah, and you're teaching still?
I am. I've pared back my teaching somewhat, but I do teach bassoon at the University of Utah here, and at a local private university, our private college, Westminster College. And so I have a very, very small teaching studio kind of at the moment. But I do enjoy the teaching, and I find it very fun. And I was just coaching the Utah Youth Orchestra bassoon section this past weekend, and had a lot of fun with that. So it's enjoyable. It's just, sometimes juggling things and trying to find the time for everything. And I tend to do things in spurts where it's either a very intense period where I'm very, very productive, or, a period where I have to be focused on something else. So I'm kind of up and down with my writing and puzzle making productivity. It just kind of varies between just a ridiculous amount of stuff at once, and then, flatline for a period.
And I hope we get into composing some music. Not that I want to tell you what to do, but I would be fascinated to hear whatever you come up with.
Well, for now, I'll enjoy what you compose.
Yeah,
I'll live vicariously.
Lori, this was really nice. It's always good to talk to you. We don't do it often enough. In fact, we'll have to do it when I haven't got a list of questions and all the stress of a podcast.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, thanks so much. This was great fun.